Welcome to 5 Good Minutes.
You're listening to today's inspirational message
On the book of Romans.
with Brady Randall.
Well, we've packed a lot into 5 verses of Romans 5. We made a whole week of it, in fact. And as I said on day one of the benefits of taking a longer time with a shorter text is the depth that you can get into. And I don't know what kind of Bible reader you are or if you've ever been a Bible reader, but I want to encourage you to become one, and not just a reader, but someone who engages with the text, somebody who asks questions, wrestles with God, what you're reading. In fact, that's really how it soaks into our souls. And sometimes what happens when we start out to read the Bible is that we want to read it cover to cover, multiple chapters at a time, and there's a lot of value in that, but there's also something to be said for taking time to just chew verse by verse. And what we've seen so far in this chapter of Romans 5, is that as a result of being justified or made right with God, we have access to peace with God. We now stand in God's grace, and we can boast in the hope of the glory of God. And not only that, but even our sufferings are used to produce perseverance, which produces character, which ultimately produces hope. And then verse 5 again, this hope does not put us to shame because God's love has been poured out into our hearts through the Holy Spirit who has been given to us. I remember when I was a kid and I would play in the shallow end of a pool. And even though this shallow end for me is like a 3-year-old, the pool looked massive, like an ocean. And I would fill a bucket after bucket and I would keep pouring it out. And as a kid, I thought this has got to have a limit on how many buckets I could fill. But there was more than enough that the pool had to offer. It was an endless water supply for all of my buckets. I would never run out, even in the shallow end. And I think that's a little bit of a picture here of what we're left with. That if you belong to Jesus, God's love has been poured out into our hearts through the Holy Spirit who's been given to us. In other words, one of the main ways in which a person experiences the love of God is through the Spirit of God. And as we continue in the book of Romans, we'll be reading more about the role of the Holy Spirit in those who belong to Jesus. But suffice it to say, the Holy Spirit is a way that we experience God. So God in his essence has always existed from the very beginning as Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And this is what theologians call the Trinity. And though that word is not in the Bible, it's a perplexing truth that is taught in the Scriptures, that God is one being in 3 distinct persons. So in other words, the Father is not the Son, the Father is not the Spirit, the Son is not the Father, the Son is not the Spirit, and vice versa. But Jesus and the Holy Spirit and God the Father are one God. It helps me to kind of think about the roles that they play in salvation. For example, I think of it as the 3 A's. So God the Father authors salvation. He's the one that from the beginning of time, he knew and authored a way for a human being to be in his presence. And Jesus, the Son, accomplishes that salvation through his death and resurrection from the cross, not from the resurrection from the dead. And then the Holy Spirit then applies the reality of salvation to those who trust in Jesus. In fact, I've heard the Holy Spirit described as the shy member of the Trinity. The Holy Spirit has a spotlight ministry, if you were, whereby he shines a light on Christ and the teaching of Christ and the ministry of Christ. That's what the Holy Spirit does, is basically lights up Jesus. And the Holy Spirit was given to believers as a deposit and a guarantee of their salvation. And here what we read is that God's love has been poured out into our hearts through the Holy Spirit. And all of this is a work of God. He's the one that makes it happen. And he gives you and I this experiential reminder that he loves you. But this experience is not a fuzzy, warm feeling, though it can have, I'm not saying you may not get those feelings when you are overwhelmed with the love of God, but this feeling is based on a reality of what Jesus has done. So, for example, if you look at your own life and circumstances, and maybe you're sitting here today listening to this podcast, and you might have come to the conclusion that God doesn't love you based on your life. You see, Brady, if you only knew what I've been through, you'd conclude the same thing. But what I would say is that the basis of God's love is not just your life and circumstance, but His life and what He's already done when He went to the very depths and farthest possible lengths to demonstrate this life by the giving of His life for yours. And when we get that, it's frankly overwhelming. And it begins to overwhelm our hearts, which again is really the control center of our bodies. And this is why you and I have to be intentional in remembering what's true, meditating on what has already been done, that no one loves you like Jesus. And my hope and prayer for you today is that you'd experience that wholeheartedly in this next season.
Thanks for joining us here today. There's a lot of great content to explore on Orchard Hill Plus and on the Orchard Hill main feed from the weekend. Have a great day.